Good evening and welcome to the third annual recognition of the J.P. Hendrickson Faculty Scholar and presentation of the Herbert Cheever Jr. Liberal Arts Lecture. Thank you all for joining us in this celebration of the value of a liberal education within the College of Arts and Sciences. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dennis Papini, Dean of the College since the fall of 2012. My job is to help our students and faculty achieve personal and professional success both in and out of the classroom. Tonight's award and lecture are named in honor of two former arts and sciences professors and administrators. Professor John Phillip Hendrickson was a longtime faculty member and head of the Department of Political Science from 1957 to 1988. Herbert Cheever Jr. served as professor in political science from 1968 until his retirement 32 years later in 2000. He also served as department head for 9 of those years and as acting dean of the College of Arts and Sciences in 1985-86 and 91-92, and was dean from 1992 to 2000. At this time, I'd like to pause for a moment of silence in honor of Herbert Cheever, who passed away last Friday. Dean Cheever lived a meaningful life, and his example continues to inspire others to a life of achievement and service. Our condolences to Sidna, his wife, sons Jason, Michael, and Jean, and their families. He will be missed. This lecture was created to elevate understanding and appreciation for the value of a liberal education. Before we present Dr. Peterson's lecture, I'd like to take a few minutes and review what the faculty of the College of Arts and Sciences have implemented over the past few years in an effort to address the vitality and relevance of a liberal education. As you well know, higher education in general and the liberal arts in particular have been under increasing scrutiny and pressure. In the past few years, critics of higher education have questioned the value of the liberal arts. How many philosophers, that's your profession, Greg, and psychologists, that's my profession, and historians, archaeologists, etc., how many of these graduates do we need? Universities are increasingly held accountable for preparing students to lead meaningful lives after graduation and, at the same time, preparing them to pursue career opportunities in the workplace. In the College of Arts and Sciences, we're convinced that preparing students with the breadth of a liberal arts education and preparing them for the modern workplace are not opposing goals. To that end, we have been reinforced in our commitment to creative and innovative changes designed to better serve the 20% of our students who will go on to graduate and professional schools and the 80% who will use their degrees to enter the workforce upon graduation. These changes have occurred in 3 major areas: our college's structure, our curriculum, and our facilities. We have realigned units within our college to promote collaboration across disciplines as we prepare our students to work in high-performing teams that are a standard expectation in today's workplace. Changes in the structure include establishing a school of design that brings together all of the design disciplines into a single unit. We also played an important role in establishing the new Division of Management and Economics. And as we speak, conversations are taking place that may result in the formation of a School of Performing Arts and a School of Journalism and Communication. We are working on securing accreditation, an important hallmark of academic excellence, for our theater, architecture, landscape architecture, studio art, graphic design, interior design, and economics departments. We have increased our graduate and undergraduate offerings to include majors in public relations, community and regional planning. We added a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology and a doctorate in biochemistry. In addition, we have transformed our college graduation requirements so that, among other things, all newly entering students are required to earn either a minor or a teaching certificate that will help them achieve a T-shaped profile at graduation. A T-shaped profile is a model used to describe the abilities of people in the workplace. The vertical bar, the T-stem, represents specialized knowledge, skills, or expertise that is in high demand by employers. In the liberal arts, these are things that many of our students historically shy away from. The horizontal bar, the T-top, are the so-called soft skills, the ability to work together collaboratively across disciplines with experts from other disciplines. We're also changing our majors and minors to better serve the needs of students, hoping to create a clear pathway to this T-shaped profile, which historically has been found to provide students quicker access to meaningful work and more rapid advancement through the organizational structure. We've added an experiential learning certificate that provides an array of different hands-on learning experiences where students must demonstrate the ability to transfer what they've learned in the classroom to real-world problems. Making excellence inclusive is also a critical priority for the college. To that end, we have made several strategic diversity hires. Dr. Delphine Redshirt, a new associate professor, will begin her work to establish a language institute next fall. We've hired a former underrepresented dissertation fellow, Dr. Laura Renee Chandler, as an assistant professor of history, and we fully intend to hire additional fellows as the opportunity arises. We're building new facilities or renovating current ones to provide optimal learning environments. Our architecture program is now housed in the new Lohr Architecture, Math, and Engineering building. We'll soon break ground on a major expansion of the Performing Arts Center that will enhance facilities for performances and hopefully house the new School of Performing Arts. Also in the discussion stages are a building to house the School of Design and renovating other facilities, for example, Harding Hall, to house academic departments in the college, and a variety of other smaller renovation projects. As you can see, we've been very busy transforming our college so that you, our students, receive a high-quality liberal education, an education that allows you to follow your passion, engage in discovery and creativity, and prepares you to choose professional and personal opportunities over the course of a lifetime that will enrich your lives and the lives of others. And now on to Dr. Peterson's lecture. To commemorate this special event, we commissioned a medallion to be presented each year to the faculty member who delivers this lecture. A graphic design student from the visual art department designed this medallion especially for this event. You will note that the medallion, the symbol for this event, appears on the cover of your printed program. 2 years ago, during the inaugural event, we presented plaques to both the Hendrickson family and Dr. Cheever. We also have a special plaque posted in the lobby of the main office of the college. This plaque recognizes the Hendrickson Scholar and Cheever Fellow with a new name added each year. And now it's time for the lecture. At the end of the lecture, we should have time for questions from the audience. I have asked Dr. Prigge, head of the Department of History, Political Science, Philosophy, and Religion, who nominated Greg Peterson for this award, to introduce our honored speaker and present the medallion.
My colleague, Dr. Peterson, suffers from an image problem, and his problem is the college's problem. Philosophy was famously made the poster child for useless degrees when our governor questioned why anyone would spend their time and money pursuing it in college. The problem with the degree, it would seem that it was insufficiently applied. However, what the governor was expressing was perhaps an imperfect understanding of what it is that my colleague does. It's not to ponder esoteric subjects high on Olympus, untouched by the world below. Instead, he requires our students to think precisely and deliberately. And what's the utility in that? Philosophy ranks among the top, if not the top, year after year on LSAT exams, GMAT, and GRE. The deans of both engineering and ag bio have sought out the services of philosophy. Dr. Peterson's logic course is the cornerstone of our legal studies minor, and it was the USD Law School who insisted that ethics also be required. Dr. Peterson is nothing if not applied. His research and interests have straddled the line between religion, science, and philosophy since his earliest days as an undergrad. The questions of artificial intelligence and evolution have fascinated him because it raises some of the most basic questions. What does it mean to be human? When would this have happened? Based on what criteria? Are human qualities unique to humans? His publications, which include a monograph, 2 edited volumes, and over 40 articles, runs the gamut from agriculture to democracy and civic culture to trade policies. He has been invited to speak on multiple occasions as far away as Qatar. He and his research partners have won multiple grants, and his current project has him teamed with, among others, a neuroscientist and a political scientist, studying if, when, and why individuals step in to help. Tonight's presentation, The Good, the True, and the Beautiful, will discuss the university's role in contributing to the global good. Dr. Peterson and his research exemplifies the qualities this award seeks to highlight. It's my honor to present the keynote speaker for tonight, my colleague and friend, Dr. Gregory Peterson.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to begin with just some acknowledgments, some of which have already been expressed. So I'd like to thank both the Cheever and Hendrickson families for supporting this event, and the honor not only of my being here, which I feel very humbled by, but just to have this sort of event at this campus, which when I first came here, there were certainly things going on. But it seemed a little bit sleepier place than it is now. And it's events like this that create an intellectual community where ideas are exchanged, and which I am very appreciative of. So I want to very much thank you for the support for this event and for what will hopefully be part of the beginning of many such events to come in the future. I'd like also to extend thanks not only to the committee who foolishly selected me for this honor, but also to my department and departmental colleagues in the college for creating an environment where this sort of event can happen. Now, as some of you know, I'm on sabbatical technically, so I'm really not supposed to be here. And I was really getting into the swing of it, and it did take a little bit of effort to get up this morning. So this is what I looked like when I rose, and fortunately there are these inventions called razors that helped me clean up a bit, and I managed to get the straw off my back, and now I'm looking almost presentable. I should also add that as a way of clarifying, I was talking to a friend this week, and he was a little bit confused when I mentioned the title of my talk. And so when I mentioned it, he thought I was talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I just want to clarify, it's the good, the true, and the beautiful. So if you came thinking I was going to be talking about spaghetti westerns, I apologize. That's something we can maybe do at some other time, and we could have a rich discussion about Clint Eastwood and squinting and so on. So I'll begin my talk. I'm going to apologize just one more time. So I'm going to read this. So as Dr. Prigge mentioned, philosophers like precision, and so in reading this, prepared comments, this allows me to be a little bit more precise and preserve some, hopefully, some elegance of language that would perhaps be lost. But I will try to keep it lively And if I fail at that, there are smartphones with cat videos on them, I know, and that can kind of perk you up a bit, I hope. So we begin. In a provocative passage in the Republic, Plato makes the bold claim that the form of the good is the source of knowledge, and so consequently, there is an intimate connection between the true and the good. The good, the true, and the beautiful, each in their own way preoccupied the great thinkers of the ancient and medieval world. For them, more so than for us, it was not uncommon to think of the three profoundly linked. More than 2 millennia later, Keats could pen the famous lines that truth is beauty and beauty is truth and send a shudder of recognition through his readers. So I just kind of share this quote up here from the Republic, from this provocative passage where Plato makes this link between the good and the true in particular. And we might want to connect this to just this other quote. There's a couple places where we find this in Socrates' mouth, this question of ethics, which we link to that notion of how should we live our life and what could be more important than that as a question. Right, and so that's something to dwell on as we proceed. We who have survived the 20th century and survey the 21st are not so sure about these links. More than aware that truths are often brutally ugly, we recognize that what is true may be the opposite of what is good. And many among us have grown skeptical of our ability of even to speak of the good at all. Since the primary problems of our century require sophisticated knowledge of the facts, we often prefer to focus on them instead, hoping that if we can get the facts sorted out, the values will follow. In a globally connected age, the facts are plentiful. On September 2nd, 2015, a photographer captured the image of Aylan Kurdi's 3-year-old body washed up on the Turkish coastline. One of the more than 1 million migrants and refugees entering Europe this past year, young Kurdi was neither the first nor the last child to die attempting to cross the watery divide separating Europe from those fleeing poverty, insecurity, and conflict in Africa, Afghanistan, and the Middle East. In 2015, Europe absorbed over 1 million migrants. Because of the Syrian conflict alone, some 12 million people have been displaced. Of these, 4 million have sought refuge elsewhere, and with nearly 2 million fleeing to Turkey alone. Although the photograph of Kurdi's dead body, along with subsequent events, launched international focus on the issue, the current influx is itself a spike in a larger pattern. According to the UN, Europe has absorbed some 20 million international migrants since 2000 for an average of 1.3 million per year. And although the drama of European migration has captured our attention, the facts of migration are by no means unique. According to UN data, North America absorbs approximately 900,000 immigrants per year. And some scholars point to the ongoing internal rural to urban migration occurring within China as the largest in world history. So we see here just the sort of variation in applications per country. Some of us have been following this closely, so this is familiar. Perhaps a little bit less familiar is this data here indicating migration by continent. And so we see Europe over the span from 2000 to 2015 with a kind of increasing trend line. But we see also, here we have North America, and also we see a fair amount of migration going on in Asia. Migration opens a range of issues. Should migrants be allowed to enter one's own country or not? If migrants are allowed to enter, what criteria should apply? Must they be refugees, or could they also be economic migrants? Should we make the decision based on national self-interest, and should such national self-interest trump what we conceive to be our own individual self-interest? Further, do nations have an obligation to help others, even if such help does not aid the national self-interest, or if it involves some cost or sacrifice? If nations do have such an obligation, how is that obligation distributed? Should Sweden not complain when they receive many, but neighboring Denmark receives few? On what grounds do we refuse a helping hand to young Aylan Kurdi washed up on the beach? The issue of migration is but an example. But we could easily cite others. Although climate scientists can project future impacts of climate change and economists can model the costs of various courses of actions, we still must decide more fundamental questions concerning how the costs of mitigating climate change are to be shared. Whether and to what extent wealthy countries have greater responsibilities than poor countries, and whether those who have polluted the most in the past have the greater obligation, both to future generations and to those living in countries that will be disproportionately affected. Sociologists can provide data concerning the disproportionate incarceration of African American males, the roots of systemic racism, and the causal factors impacting the intersection of race and poverty. And biologists can inform us of new techniques of gene editing that magnify the ease with which they can eliminate diseases or alter our very nature. But these facts by themselves do not determine which of several policies addressing racial inequality may be best, or whether and when we should alter the very core of our biology. These are problems of what we often think of as the global good. And to think that there is a global good is to think that these problems have solutions that are better or worse for all involved. If these problems of decision-making have a solution, their basis resides in more than a simple recitation of empirical facts. To make such decisions, we inevitably rely on some value set. Having the right set of values does not guarantee that we will make good decisions. If we are poorly informed, or if we have poor reasoning skills, being good of heart avails us little. In the parlance of philosophy, having the right values is not sufficient for good decision-making, but they are a necessary condition of good decision-making. Put differently, decision-making is necessarily a valuational procedure. And if we believe there is something called good decision-making, then we believe that there are such things as good value sets. Plato thought that the good is deeply related to the true, and that values are the sort of thing that we could have knowledge about. His mentor Socrates thought the same, but he was ambivalent about whether values are the sort of thing that can be taught. Plato's disciple Aristotle was more optimistic, but thought that one had to be of the requisite experience, have the requisite experiences in life first. So there's this passage in Nicomachean Ethics where Aristotle says that basically you have to be 40 years old before you can study ethics. On my gloomy days, I agree. If there can be such a thing as knowledge about values, about right and wrong, what role does the university, do the humanities have in discovering such truths? Okay, so here I'm going to move to the main portion of my argument. So I'm going to talk about what I'm going to conceive of as three functions of the university. One, economic, one as a repository, and then thirdly, what I'm going to call the moral function of the university as an institution. And then in the final section, what I'm going to do is argue that the humanities have a central role in that moral function. And I'm going to use some of the literature on empathy and some how philosophers and psychologists talk about this to get at that a little bit. As an institution, the university has a long history, and while we can point to ancient predecessors, we tend to trace the genealogy of the modern university to the institutions pioneered in the Middle Ages at Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Despite this, the idea of what constitutes properly a university has undergone considerable change. And while we still find the disciplines of the trivium and quadrivium present in modified form, the scope of the university has since much expanded. What was once called natural philosophy is now called science, and we nowadays separate basic sciences from applied sciences, physical sciences from biological sciences, and natural sciences from social sciences. Land-grant universities in particular place emphasis on programs connected to professions, but they are by no means unique in this. Indeed, the three higher degrees one could pursue in the medieval university, theology, law, and medicine, were all connected to the professions of the day. And the much wider range of majors that students can now pursue is in no small way a sign of the growth and complexity of modern society. If we could ask the question, why do we have universities? The justification that most quickly comes to mind is an economic one. A primary reason students enroll is because a university education is the ticket to a more lucrative and usually a more satisfying career. Government officials also tie universities to broader issues of economic development. Universities not only produce students, they also produce knowledge, and much of this knowledge is economically useful, leading to new inventions, patents, and occasionally entire new classes of commodities and services. While governors are interested in how education may boost the local state economy, presidents and prime ministers are interested in how education serves the national economy and thus the national self-interest. These are distinct arguments with distinct interests in mind. The most commonly cited data concerns salaries, and studies based on the U.S. Census indicate that the median lifetime earnings for those with a bachelor's degree is $1 million more, close to twice as much as those completing only high school diplomas. So you see here the high school folks, you see here the bachelor's degree, and you can quickly do the math. What you major in clearly matters, and humanities graduates who don't go on to graduate school make quite a bit less than petroleum engineers and computer scientists. And of course, we all know this, so if we look at, this is based on the census data pulled from the Chronicle of Higher Education website, and so you see here the range by major, and then if you break out, well, you see humanities over here, and if you break those out, you'll see, at least on this measure of philosophy and religious studies, being kind of the middle of the pack there. If we look at some other data, it's a little bit nicer to philosophers at least. So this is based on a private group pay scale. They did a survey, and 10, 20 years out, if you're a philosophy major, presumably you can make $82,000 as a median salary. Such salary benefits tend to hold up cross-culturally and form part of the argument promoting education, at least to the right sort, as part of a strategy of economic growth. And here we just see for Europe based on OECD data here. And so upshot, people with higher degrees tend to make more. For present purposes, I won't belabor these arguments or engage in their complexities. Suffice it to say that most of us are convinced that these arguments are correct. And they support the claim that a main function, perhaps the only function of the university, is to serve individual economic interests and the local and national economy. The economic argument is a powerful one, but we should be suspicious when the claim is made that the purpose of the university is purely economic in character. For one thing, the argument is ambiguous. To promote individual economic welfare is not identical to promoting the economic welfare of the local state or nation. For example, my best economic option may be to study medicine. I might be inspired by, say, the Grey's Anatomy show. But the national economy might be maximized by a general policy that reduces medical costs and channels me into a field I am not quite as well suited for. Individual economic self-interest and national economic self-interest are not identical. And so if we are going to maximize economic interest, we have to decide which one. It is noteworthy that the arguments for university education based on state or national economic interests are potentially quite illiberal, denying citizens the right to pursue their own interests to serve the interests of the state. While economic factors are certainly important on the individual level, they are not the only ones. According to the census data, one might argue that individuals ought to study petroleum engineering to be more like the character played by Bruce Willis in Armageddon, since that is the profession with the highest median income coming out of college. Of course, many people do not have any interest in becoming petroleum engineers. Not only might they prefer to be doctors or electrical engineers, they might prefer to be social workers, elementary school teachers, or actors. So they might be inspired by Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society, or they might be inspired by all these actors and want to be an actor instead. While earnings are certainly a factor for most of us, for most as they weigh career options, they are typically not the only factor. In the current election cycle, a presidential candidate recently opined that the nation would be better served by producing more welders than philosophers. Of course, the nation does produce more welders than philosophers, and much subsequent discussion focused on the comparative salaries of the two professions. Philosophers don't do so bad. But such debates miss the larger question of who it is that gets to decide such issues. Should the state dictate what professions or courses of study students pursue, or do students have some say in the matter? Granted, we can't all be successful in the careers we wish to pursue, and there are many failed novelists turned computer programmers. But if students are not allowed to pursue their dreams, how much is lost? Anyone can tell you that pursuing acting or novel writing is sheer foolishness. Many of us know this, right? And that the odds are too stacked against the student wishing to be successful. Yet some do become successful, and those that don't sometimes apply what they learned beneficially to other occupations. Further, attempting to direct students into majors they don't want not only alienates them, but it presumes the state bureaucrats can adequately foresee what future labor needs will be. How many state planners in 1990 foresaw the economic impact of the World Wide Web? Which ones in 2000 planned adequately for the advancements in solar energy technology or the innovations spurred by companies like Tesla? Finally, when we make the economic argument, it is worthwhile to consider on what grounds we make it. If we argue that the value of the university lies solely in economic benefits, what kind of argument is it? Although we might think it is an economic argument, it is clearly not that. As a scientific discipline, economics doesn't tell us what to value. Rather, economics informs how systems of exchange work given assumptions about what kind of preferences we have. The argument about the economic value of a university education is an argument about economic value, and is indeed an argument about values. Such an argument seems to be a philosophical argument about what we should value, and it is on philosophical grounds that such an argument should be assessed. It is an important argument, one that should be studied carefully. Where might we acquire the skills to do that? While the economic benefits of the university are significant, a second important function of the university is as a repository of knowledge, perhaps best symbolized historically by the university library. The library itself is an important resource, a first stop for the full range of knowledge, pertinent and obscure. More generally, universities often provide specialized archives, preserving original source material that cannot be found anywhere else in the world. Universities are repositories for more than just books and historical documents, and university collections may include anything from pottery shards and dinosaur bones to seed banks and ice core samples. So the ice core sample, and of course the art museum, those are our own. All of these are very physical manifestations of our collected knowledge. Preserving them is expensive, and in some cases, but not all, these expenses can be justified in economic terms. Seed banks can be important for the advancement of agriculture, and collections of biological materials contribute to breakthroughs in medicine. Such repositories, however, are useless without the expertise to utilize and explore them. And so the idea of the university as a repository of knowledge is deeply connected to the university as a repository of expertise. At land-grant universities in particular, this may take the form of extension services designed to directly benefit members of the community. But the expertise in the university contributes in myriad ways. Some of those forms may be economic, and researchers at universities may be tapped to contribute to the basic scientific and technological innovations that drive the economy, sometimes manifesting in public-private partnerships between university and industry. But the expertise is crucial in other ways as well. As the United States proceeds into its second and possibly, God forbid, third decade of conflict in the Middle East, sophisticated knowledge of the history and politics of the region, tangled as it is with the complexity and diversity of the monotheistic faiths, is crucial. Those with such expertise are frequently tapped by local media as a resource to aid the public in understanding the ongoing dynamics of current events, and academic researchers may serve more directly as experts for governmental institutions in their daily function and decision-making process. So we see, various people who are kind of famous for doing this, but not only people who are very famous. We have people here who do this in various capacities. But we can think of people like Condoleezza Rice, Sonia Sotomayor, Henry Chu, or Cass Sunstein, and we can think of also people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who plays an important role in communicating science to the public, and which is vital for the public to understand what science is and what its significance is, both in daily life and the life of ideas. The extent to which we value the university as a repository of knowledge depends on how and to what extent we value knowledge more generally. Knowledge that has direct economic benefit is the easiest to justify for many of us, and knowledge that contributes to our social and physical well-being is a relatively easy sell. But not all knowledge has such obvious benefits. Potsherds are important for dating archaeological finds in the Mediterranean, but potsherd repositories take up space and cost money. The study of Latin and ancient Greek may not seem immediately useful to many, but the world would seem poorer if we as a society lost completely the ability to comprehend the writings of the ancient world in their original languages. How many experts in Greek or Latin or Sanskrit do we need? How do we weigh the significance of collections of hominid skulls or tax data from the 19th century? Note that these are once again valuational questions. Deciding them requires insightful judgment of the value of knowledge in general and its contribution to being human. To argue that we ought to have universities because of their economic benefits and because of the need for repositories of knowledge implies that we can make such arguments, that in some sense we can know which decision among alternatives is best. If such arguments are easy, no special insight or training may be required. But if they are not, if they are hard and complicated, then it would be helpful to have experts to help provide insight into these questions of value and to train others to do likewise. If this is the case, this suggests that the university has a third function, and that the university is not just a repository of knowledge and an economic institution, but also a moral one. This claim, no doubt, makes some uncomfortable, and for a variety of reasons. For one thing, many of us surveying the first decades of the 21st century find values difficult to talk about. Facts, we think, are out there in the world, ready to be discovered by the intrepid investigator. Values are invisible, squishy, intangible, and because of that, it is tempting to think of values to be merely the expression of opinions and nothing more. We might call this the skeptical argument. For another, even if we do subscribe to the notion that values are not merely figments of our imagination, we may still be reluctant to think that they are the sort of thing that should be discussed, let alone endorsed, at the university. Universities are about the true, not the good, we might think. And the university should be neutral concerning competing conceptions of the good. Such neutrality may have a further political grounding, resting in First Amendment freedoms of speech and religion. On this conception, the state, and by extension the university, should not take sides in moral debates, focusing on skills instead. Even if we were to engage in the analysis and instruction of values, there is the further question of whose values we should engage. There seem to be nearly as many value sets as there are people. How do we decide between them? Right, so we have three counter-arguments that probably immediately come to mind with this proposal of the university as a moral institution. So we can think of the skeptical argument, the neutrality argument, and then the question of whose values we would develop. If we have followed the argument I've made so far, the issue of skepticism quickly fades away. If we truly believe that there are reasons for having universities, and if these reasons are partly economic and partly because of the importance of the university as a repository of knowledge, we've already given arguments that presume the value we hold is also the one that should be shared by others. To attempt to persuade others that they should value something based on rational considerations is to imply that skepticism about values is false. But there is also a further point to recognize, which is that the very act of instruction is itself a valuational exercise in at least two ways. First, the very act of instruction requires norms of behavior, and we as instructors expect students to obey such norms and eventually, the sooner the better, to internalize them as well. A good student is one who, among other things, does not cheat or plagiarize. And when we hold a class discussion or seminar, we expect our students to employ the norms of rational discourse and to not insult, demean, or verbally abuse the other students in the class. As the philosopher Jürgen Habermas has argued, discourse itself requires its own ethic, and effective and proper discourse requires at its basic level proper respect for the other. Professors strive to model this behavior for students, and such modeling is itself a form of teaching. And so I would just highlight the honors program here and all the things that Tim Nichols has done. We have in the honors program these honors seminars, and in that seminar you have that discourse ethic being practiced on a regular basis, and we see that going on there. But of course, not only there, that all programs across the university engage in this on a daily basis. And so there is an ethic to the classroom is the argument I'm making. And this is an ethic that we ourselves as instructors are modeling as a daily basis to our students with, among other things, the hope that they learn and imbibe that. A further point, in instructing students in a given field, we are also training them to consider the knowledge that they are acquiring as itself a kind of good. Those who study history are often passionate about the study of history and its value. And in taking the time to instruct others about history, they are also in that process conveying implicitly and explicitly the value of the knowledge as well. Put differently, the teaching of values is not something that can be avoided because the very act of teaching is itself a valuational endeavor. What then of the concern that the university be a neutral party that focuses on instruction of the true rather than the good? It is important to note that those making this argument are tapping a long pedigree in the history of political philosophy. We're lurking everywhere. Beginning with John Locke and tracing its way through such influential thinkers as John Stuart Mill and recent philosophers as varied as Robert Nozick and John Rawls. Even if we are highly partisan, this liberal conception of the state is deeply ingrained in us, and we would be appalled if the state suddenly adopted, say, Presbyterianism as the national religion, or Seventh-day Adventists, or Buddhism, or just pick your group that you're not a member of. Or limited speech about American military involvement. And we would be similarly alarmed if faculty were expected to instruct students to believe that abortion is always wrong, or that neo-Marxist critiques of sweatshop labor are always true, or the converse. Such points are correct as far as they go, but it's worth considering why we endorse such neutrality. As many political philosophers have pointed out, neutrality is itself a value. And the last thing that advocates of neutrality want is for us to be neutral about the value of neutrality. Think about it. Lying behind neutrality, I would suggest, is a prior value of autonomy. It is important to respect the freedom of others to make decisions and form their own beliefs. And there are certain kinds of life lessons that can be learned only as the result of autonomous action. As Locke argued, it is often futile to coerce belief, and the attempt to do so often backfires, creating resentment and opposition to the very values that one is trying to instill. Although this would take longer to develop as an argument, I would suggest that the value of neutrality is implicitly a value of autonomy, and more specifically, autonomy to believe and do certain kinds of things. What we want to do in a university, in fact, is to develop the sense of autonomy, but also to do so in the right way. Such an autonomy should be, in some sense, a rational autonomy. And so one of the things we wish to do in the university is to aid students in developing reasoning skills so that they are better able to choose freely. Further, we want them to learn to believe things, including beliefs about which values to hold, based on rational considerations that they themselves can affirm. And this requires that we expose them to a wide range of alternative beliefs and values so that their decision is in fact as rational as can be and not coerced. The recent debate about the use of trigger warnings in speech in the classroom and on the campus is, I would suggest, a debate about how we best develop students' autonomy. How best do we introduce students to material that they might consider offensive or which could trigger strong emotions that are difficult to manage, particularly when you're young and impressionable and all that? Note that this is once again a value question and is not a question that we can escape. If our decisions about trigger warnings is not the result of some mere whim, we have made that decision based on some value set, which itself becomes embodied in the culture of the university. So the neutrality objection is partially correct. There are things that we want to be neutral about in the university, but this is because neutrality is value embracing the importance of autonomy and the development of students' ability to engage in critical reasoning. And while there are a wide range of values about which the university is neutral, there are also concrete values that the university holds in which we have some expectation that students will hold as well. Racism and sexism find no purchase in the 21st century university. And while we might encourage students in certain contexts to study and engage racist and sexist arguments, we do so in a way that does not consider these to be live options for students to endorse or not, but historical curiosity and warning signs for how society is and could develop in the future. We want and expect our students to be neither racist nor sexist. And if they enter the university with either racist or sexist views, we hope that by the time they leave the university, they will have come to understand that such views are erroneous. We cannot compel such belief, and indeed we do not want to compel such belief. That would violate the university community's prior commitment to autonomy and to the development of critical reasoning. But it is nevertheless a goal of the university that we produce students who have such values, and we as faculty would be deeply embarrassed if we fail to have an impact on such beliefs or inadvertently encourage them rather than the opposite. What then are the final basic concern? Whose values do we teach? By this point, I hope that answer has started to become clear. The values we teach are our values, the values that the university community jointly holds and which we believe to be in some sense the right and proper values for members of society. Such values are sometimes taught explicitly, but they are taught implicitly on a daily basis when we ourselves model behavior that is not racist or sexist, when we model honesty in communication and the value of autonomy and critical self-reflection. This is not to deny that there is a great deal of diversity among university faculty. Faculty may be liberal or conservative. Some are pacifists who believe that military intervention is always wrong, while others believe that military intervention to prevent genocide is a moral obligation. Some faculty are vegetarians and subscribe passionately to the belief that one should eat locally. Others believe with equal passion that we have a duty to feed the world and that this takes priority over worries about pesticides and environmental impact. Some are deeply convinced that the only just state is one that minimizes inequality. Others are equally convinced that prosperity is achieved only through the unfettered operation of the free market. How then can we describe the university as a moral institution when such deep disagreements divide its members? What these disagreements reveal, I argue, is the final value of the university, which is the value of actively engaging rational disagreement itself. We have universities because there is so much we do not know, and among the things about which we do not know are many issues of basic values. This is not a unique feature of value inquiry, but a feature of inquiry itself. Biologists engage in debates about allopatric versus sympatric speciation. Physicists debate the relative merits of string theory. And political scientists debate the causal factors impacting democratization and de-democratization. We are not threatened by these debates, but rather engage them as a spur to new research and discovery. I would suggest that we find a parallel story about values. While we share basic commitments about the practical value of honesty in the classroom and the importance of self-reflection, autonomy, and critical thinking, there is much that we as faculty have yet to understand. Because we value rational inquiry, we value also the inquiry into our own basic values, and such inquiry is ever ongoing and subject to debate. We as faculty, when we are successful as faculty, engage such debates actively, using all the tools of rational deliberation that we can muster. We do not do it equally and always as well, and it is this value inquiry, debated in the context of all the resources the university has to offer, that is perhaps the most difficult thing we do. As Socrates observed long ago, it is also the most important. And I'd like to just do a little shout out to one very small place this takes place, which is the Philosophy Club. So President Shen Chu and the other officers have done a really intrepid job the past 2 years of organizing forums that bring in faculty. Here, these are pictures from a forum where Dr. Renee Chandler come in and talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the related issues to that. And these little forums provide very vital debate among not only faculty and students, but also community members who come and participate in them. And it's just one of the many ways that the university facilitates this sort of dialogue. All right, so now we turn to the humanities. So this final section, I begin with this quote of a quote. So there's this famous paper by Garrett Hardin, The Tragedy of the Commons. I sometimes use this in my environmental ethics class. Many of you have probably read it at some point in your education. And the article begins with this quote from another paper by Weissner and York, was actually about national security issues. So think 1960s, Cold War, mutually assured destruction, and all those sorts of things. And so in their analysis of trying to figure out how to deal with these very complex problems, Weissner and York state it is our considered professional judgment that this dilemma has no technical solution. So we can think of that as a launching point for thinking about the humanities, among other things. So many problems don't have technical solutions. Some do. Some problems require only the invention of some new device, a tractor, or a new medicine that will take care of the issue. The solution to climate change is likely to be partly technical, involving further discoveries in renewable technologies and carbon capture that have yet to be developed. But as the recent Paris Agreement on climate testifies, the solution to climate change is not merely technical, and it will require joint action by nations on a common problem of the kind we have only rarely seen in the past. Such agreements are necessarily political in character, involving many factors, from the self-interest of politicians to the vested interests of corporations. But at the end of the day, we would like such an agreement to be fair and just, to give each what is due to them. If the university is a moral institution, then the humanities have a particularly important role to play. All of us can and do engage in moral inquiry on a daily basis. But while such practices as accounting and the study of anatomy may involve certain kinds of value, they are not practices that actively inquire into value questions themselves. It is in the humanities, and in philosophy in particular, that we find the inquiry into values to be of importance and sometimes the center of inquiry. This is not to say that the study of the humanities in general does not have other aims or benefits. A college education in the humanities provides long-term economic and social benefits to those students who pursue such. And humanities disciplines such as history or African American studies pursue the true just as much as psychology or physics. Further, although I have not much dwelt on it, humanities disciplines such as art history and English literature have historically been concerned with reflection on the beautiful. And the concern with the beautiful is something they have historically shared with fine art disciplines such as theater or music. But the humanities disciplines in particular, precisely because they focus on the human, are relevant to our understanding of value and the good. History may be one damn thing after another, but it's also an account of saints and sinners, the wretched and the wise, and learning the rhyme of history is important for understanding what solutions make sense today. It is in philosophy, however, that value inquiry is engaged in most directly, and while the very earliest philosophers mainly pondered considerations of physics and metaphysics, Socrates pioneered inquiry into the most basic questions of right and wrong, vice and virtue, that have since shaped 2 millennia of discourse. Modern philosophy tackles many topics, from logic and abstract issues of metaphysics and epistemology to phenomenology and the conceptual analysis of the everyday. Well, what we now call ethics or morality, we use both those terms. One comes from Latin, one comes from the Greek. They have the same meaning, has been a perennial philosophical concern, from those ancient philosophers concerned with what some call the therapy of desire, to formative early modern philosophers such as David Hume and Immanuel Kant, to important contemporary thinkers like Owen Flanagan and Honora O'Neill. Modern philosophers have reflected at considerable length on issues concerning obligations across borders, including those that might arise in the context of international migration. In a seminal 1973 essay, Peter Singer argued with considerable force on behalf of helping those less fortunate in other countries. If we would sacrifice time, effort, and perhaps an expensive and brand new outfit, perhaps one like you're wearing tonight, to save a drowning child we see as we walk by, why shouldn't we expend effort and money to save the child whose life is threatened in another country? Why should the distance of the child make a difference? More recently, Gillian Brock has examined the costs and benefits both to the host country that receives immigrants and the donor country from which individuals emigrate. And David Miller has examined the differences between the right to exit a country and the right to enter another, and notes that we might think of these as different kinds of rights. Common to these divergent proposals is the assumption that when we engage in ethical reflection, we are able to properly reflect on the needs of others as others, and to weigh them appropriately as we contemplate obligations both within and across borders. We often label this ability empathy, and what we conventionally think of as empathy involves a suite of abilities that have been studied at length by both philosophers and psychologists. The morally relevant dimensions of empathy include a cognitive dimension and an emotional one. On the one hand, what we typically think of as empathy involves the capacity and willingness to think about or simulate what another person is thinking or feeling, what philosophers and psychologists sometimes call theory of mind or mind reading. Normal human beings are very good at this. Not only do we think about what other people are thinking, but we think about what they are thinking about us. And we might even think about what they are thinking about our thinking about them. And note that you just understood that. On the other hand, empathy is not merely cognitive, it is also emotional. To empathize with someone grieving is, to some extent, to grieve with them. And a teacher who shares an empathetic bond with a student not only thinks about the student's success, but smiles along with her when she gets accepted into graduate school. In Not-for-Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities, Martha Nussbaum argues that the importance of the humanities is due in part to their role in the development of empathy. Great literature and theater throws us into worlds not our own, often requiring us to take on the perspective of those who are radically different from ourselves. In the humanities, we try on different emotions and personas, requiring us to stretch our imaginations, sometimes uncomfortably, so that we understand in at least limited form what it would be like to be an orphan raised in a poorhouse in 19th century England, a village elder in Western Africa struggling to adapt to the changes imposed by the newly arrived British colonial administration, or an impoverished Indian woman struggling to feed her children and maintain her dignity and with little hope of a better life. Novels like Oliver Twist, Things Fall Apart, and Nectar in a Sieve help us to do this, enabling us to more readily grapple the international and not just local character of moral obligations. One might conclude from Nussbaum's analysis that lack of empathy is the problem, and encouraging people to be more empathetic is the solution. Such a simple reading is problematic, however, because there exist clear examples of individuals who empathize wrongly. A racist may have considerable empathy with members of the racial in-group, but none for members of racial outgroups. And we would look askance at someone who empathized equally with the unrepentant criminal who regularly commits heinous acts and the young man wrongfully imprisoned as a result of a biased legal system. Recent critics of the role of empathy in moral action, such as the psychologist Paul Bloom and the philosopher Jesse Prince, so Paul on the top, Jesse with the blue hair on the bottom, cite experiments demonstrating this effect. One experiment by Kogut and Ritoy demonstrate that subjects presented information on an individual child in most cases donate more to the individual child than when shown information about a group of 8 children. Xu et al. Provide neuroscientific evidence that empathetic reactions are mediated by race, and that whites and Chinese, or ethnic Chinese, display stronger reactions to the pain of same race individuals than to other race individuals, and similar results have been found by others. In addition, several studies by Daniel Batson and colleagues provide evidence that such biasing can be induced by priming for empathetic responses, contributing to a preference to disproportionately aid single known individuals over contributions that would benefit the group as a whole. I should add, so these studies, I point out 2 here and mentioned 3 in the article. And there's a lot of complexity in these, and so it takes some while to kind of sort through these. For our purposes here, I just want to kind of note that it's studies like these that are being used by people like Bloom and Prince to make this argument that empathy shouldn't be part of our moral deliberation. One might conclude from these results, as Bloom and Prince do, that empathy is a rather problematic emotion, and that contrary to what Nussbaum argues, we should instead minimize the role of empathy in moral decision-making rather than cultivating it. Yet, a third option exists, and for this we can appeal to a much older source, Aristotle. In his Nicomachean Ethics and elsewhere, Aristotle argues that the good life is one that aims at well-being, what the Greeks call eudaimonia, and that a good life is constituted in part by the development of virtues. Cultivation of the virtues is no easy thing, requiring time and the positive influence of social feedback and role models. Borrowing from Aristotle, we might think of empathy as a modern-day virtue, a cognitive and emotional expression that has to be cultivated properly over time so that we express it in the right way, in the right amount, and in the right time. Such an understanding of empathy involves more than simply encouraging people to feel with those who are suffering. It encourages people to not only think about and when appropriate feel with others, but also to be reflective about when and how one is doing that. In the case of Curdy's death, it was the publication of the dramatic, shocking photograph that spurred public debate that was so strong. But the fact that it took such a dramatic picture to get so many to think and feel the relevant emotions involved in the migration crisis, which by then had been developing for months, suggests how poorly tuned our empathetic triggers are. Either we underreacted to the previous news and photos of the ongoing crisis, which had already included a substantial number of deaths of men, women, and children, or we overreacted when confronted with a photo of Curdy's body on the shore. To feel empathy properly in cases like Curdy's is then an important first step, but is only the first step in contemplating the fate of a boy and his family caught up in the most tragic of situations. In the ideal case, our empathy triggers other emotions and thoughts, and these in turn lead to broader questions of justice and fairness, which are then checked against further empathetic reactions in light of our own experiences. So we might think of a simple model like this, and I just use this as kind of example. I'm not deeply invested in it, but it's just to get you thinking about what we do when we're engaging in moral deliberation, that it's actually a quite complex problem or process and involves both what psychologists call implicit and explicit process. So we start perhaps with this almost automatic empathetic reaction. We start thinking and feeling, and this leads to other thoughts, other emotions, perhaps anger, perhaps compassion. We start thinking about principles, paradigm cases, and then through all that, at some point we arrive at an integrative decision about what to do. But think about all that goes on here and how complex that is. Can empathy be cultivated in the way I propose? Some interesting evidence comes from empirical literature on medical practitioners, especially doctors. Evidence indicates that empathy in doctors declines over the course of medical school, and one neuroscientific study by Jean Dessetti supports this conclusion. Neural correlates of empathetic reaction to the witnessing of a painful procedure are weaker in doctors than in controls. So if normal people see other people getting stuck with needles, we cringe. Doctors look at that and say, Although this might seem counterintuitive, there are some obvious reasons for this. Doctors are exposed to the pain and suffering of others on a daily basis, and such exposure over time can lead to emotional exhaustion and burnout. We can thus understand the reduction of empathetic responses as an intentional protection mechanism on the part of doctors to do their job well. Doctors must often put aside their emotions to concentrate on the task at hand. But this can lead to the opposite problem, the inability to express empathy when it is indeed necessary and appropriate, a phenomenon we are all too familiar with when we complain about the poor bedside manner of some physicians. A recent but preliminary study, I think this is the one down here, indicates that classroom interventions can correct this problem, and this is consistent with other small studies that indicate a positive impact on the reading of literature and the viewing of sophisticated dramas and empathetic perception. Results that are quite consistent with Nussbaum's endorsement of the role of the humanities in cultivating empathy. And actually, one of the big topics now in med schools is medical humanities and the importance for humanities curriculum for doctors precisely because of this sort of issue. And recently, some med schools have been specifically looking for people who are humanities grads, not just science grads, because of this sort of issue. Such studies do not, in the end, tell us whether empathy is good or bad to have. Only philosophical reflection and experience can tell us that. But they do inform us whether the theories that philosophers dream up have empirical purchase, and this is an important point. Philosophers are good at thinking up things, but not all things we think up are possible. The best philosophy is therefore done in tandem with ongoing research in other disciplines. The ivory tower has its place, but only if there is a collaborative table inside of it. And I'd like to point to the collaborative table that I'm a part of. So in our giant amalgamated name of a department, history, political science, philosophy, religion, I have the privilege to work along these people and a few others who didn't quite make it into the photograph. And one of the things that this enables on a daily basis is to engage in these rich discussions across fields that spurs and motivates further inquiry. In turn, the ideals generated in philosophical discourse and debate usefully motivate research in other disciplines. Is democratization a good thing? Is income inequality a bad thing? The fact that many of us feel strongly about such questions drive the empirical research. And the empirical research in turn informs our basic intuitions about the true, the good, and the beautiful. In the final analysis, the university needs the humanities, but the humanities also need the university. And a university that lacks the humanities and a practice of the humanities in the absence of the university is a poorer world indeed. So in conclusion here, I want to kind of have you meditate on these photos as I conclude. So these are a result of a couple trips. So the one most recently to Greece with the honors program with Tim Nichols and Barb Kleinjohn and the many students, some of whom might be here. And among other things, I went to Greece and also to Turkey. We visited the city of Ephesus in Turkey. And there's this beautiful, gorgeous, ancient library. And at the front of the library, there are these beautiful women goddesses, perhaps, and we can see their names. So one of them is Sophia, wisdom, and another is episteme, knowledge, right? So 2,000 years ago, roughly, we see this. Several years back, I went to a conference in Oxford, and like many people do, I visited the Bodleian Library, and we see there at the Bodleian Library these doors, one of which is labeled natural philosophy, the sciences, another of which is moral philosophy. And so this is not a new thing. This is a long tradition. And so as we contemplate the moral function of the university, we can think of the tradition that precedes us all the way back in Ephesus, continuing through Oxford and on to today. Is the university a moral institution? Can and should it help in thinking through issues of global good? Do Nussbaum and Aristotle truly provide insight about the proper role of empathy in the moral life and its possible cultivation in a university setting? Each of these questions are debatable, but it is important to note what kind of debate they are. Although these debates can and should be informed by the findings of the natural and social sciences, which indeed are very valuable, the debates themselves are not scientific in character but philosophical, having to do with basic questions of value. To disagree with another on the answer to those questions is to engage in philosophical disagreement. Further, such questions are not trivial but vital. As educators, students, and members of society, we have a vested interest in how such questions are answered, and how we answer them collectively affects how we behave and where our tax dollars go. They are questions that cannot be ignored. They are also questions that are difficult and complex, ones that necessarily draw on the resources that only universities can effectively offer. We who survey the 21st century, who face problems of global dimensions, need a university that is self-aware of the fact that it is not only a repository of knowledge, not only an economic institution, but a moral one as well, training students who are capable not only of reflecting on the true, but also on the good and the beautiful. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Peterson for sharing his views on the value of a liberal arts education. Thank you for attending, and have a safe trip home.